Well, good morning, everybody. This is me, Ma. And on the last video, I shared with you how Fred had not met my emotional needs, so I was easily carried into temptation. But I wanted, as a child, I had read a book a long time ago, and it was like that we needed to ask God for wisdom and understanding. And I thought, well, that's a good thing to do. So I began to tack that on to my childish prayers. Not knowing that how much I would need them in later life. But I thought that it would be fitting today that I share with you Fred, his life story, so that you could understand the man that I married. Fred's father was an insurance salesman, and he made a good living for Fred's family. And Fred had an older sister who was 10 years older and a brother who was 18 months younger. So Fred actually felt like that he was kind of alone because Ms. O'Berry had to take care of the baby. But Mr. O'Berry became his best buddy. And his grandfather, who Fred knew slightly, was he and his brothers had served in the 4th Georgia Cavalry in the Civil War. So when they came back to Waycross, Georgia, where the O'Berrys had settled at that time, they packed their horses and they rode to Hernando County in Florida, which is near Dade City, because everything had been destroyed when they got home. And so Mr. O'Berry, Fred's grandfather, he owned a lot of virgin timber, and he planted a lot of citrus trees, and so he became quite wealthy. Of course, Fred knew little about him, and he didn't know how his mom and dad married, but he was born in Fred was born in Columbus, Georgia, but when he was 3 years old, they moved to Savannah, and and Mr. O'Berry was his best buddy. So in 1934, when Fred was 9 years old, his daddy, Mr. O'Berry, went to the doctor for a tonsillectomy. And so he came back home from the operation and he hemorrhaged to death before the doctor could get there. And so Fred was devastated. And then his maternal grandmother died. And if that wasn't enough, his best friend died, and then his little dog. So this was quite traumatic, and it was a terrible impact on him as a little boy. But he must have been quite a daredevil even back in those days. And Fred's mother was not an educated woman, and the only way she could keep them boys at home was to take in washing and ironing along with the insurance money that had been left to her by her husband. And the insurance money soon ran out, and she needed to do something for the boys. And I don't know how she found out about Bethesda Home for Boys, which is, I guess, I don't know, 10 or 15 miles actually from downtown Savannah. But Bethesda is a beautiful place. I mean, they had brick buildings, and it was a dairy farm, and it sat on Shipyard Creek, and they had the marshes coming from the creek up to Bethesda, and they've got massive, beautiful live oak trees out there. It's a gorgeous place for somebody to be raised. But when Fred went there, he didn't see any of that because he had to go when he was 11 years old, and another trauma on top of what all he had just gone through was pretty devastating. And he ended up in a dormitory with 12 other guys, and they had house mothers, but Mr. Burroughs, who was the superintendent, made it clear that if the older boys wanted to get their free time, that they had to make the younger boys walk the line, and they were pretty drastic in their measurements of keeping them in line sometimes. But it wasn't long before Fred grew up and he could defend himself, because Fred ended up being 6'2". And but after he got settled in, he realized it was a great place to be, and he often said that it was the best thing that his mother could have done for him, because he might have ended up at a delinquent or something. But anyway, most of the boys that grew up out there turned out to be great moral men, and I think 5 of the people that were there with Fred at the time actually become ministers. So, you know, Fred began to enjoy it, and Bethesda always had an anniversary, and it coincided with when Fred and I got married, and we always went to Bethesda for their homecoming. And I met so many of the guys, and I loved hearing the tales that they told. And of course, they had chores that they had to do. I mean, they had to milk the cows and put hay in the silos, and they had to dig posts, and they had to plow, and they had to milk the cows and wash the dishes and feed the chickens. I mean, it was a working farm. And but they had chapel, and the boys went to school at Bethesda until like they were in junior high. And so they had their regular bells that they went by. They had a bell to go to lunch and breakfast, and a bell to go to school, and a bell for recess. And but they had a lot of fun time. They had free time, and it was always an enjoyment to me to meet the guys that he grew up with. So from there, Fred had, when he was 18 years old, now Fred had already, he had excelled in sports. Fred was a perfectionist. He was very competitive. He had to be the best at everything. And he had, when back in the day, if you were really outstanding in a sport, you got a letter. So he had 5 letters in 5 different sports that he had excelled in. And so he was hoping that maybe he could get a scholarship to go to college because he was a good athlete. But when he was drafted into the Army, that dream of going to college was pretty much shattered. So he went to, when they drafted him, they gave him his choice of service. And he decided that he'd rather be in the Army. And he was listed as A1 condition. That means you can't get any better than that. So he decided that he was going to make the Army his career. So he put forth all of his efforts. That's where he learned to shoot, was in the Army. And he became a sergeant in no time. And he was drilling troops for North Africa out at Camp Beale near the Mojave Desert. And the Mojave Desert is where they had all their battles. So anyway, he went to the port of embarkation 13 times, but they always sent him back to train more troops. And he doesn't remember but having one long weekend. So probably because of the heat in the desert or the fatigue, I don't know, he ended up in the hospital, and they said that he had a rheumatic heart. Well, he didn't have one when he went in, but anyway, they said he was unfit for duty, and so they gave him a medical discharge. Well, there went Fred's hopes and dreams of making the Army his career. So he came home and tried to go to school, but he never got anything from the GI Bill, and he never got a pension. So that was another bitter pill for Fred to swallow, because he couldn't make the Army his career, and he didn't get anything from the GI Bill or no pension, and he felt like that he had actually been dishonored by his country. So anyway, from that, when he was 19 years old, he found himself married, and they had a beautiful little girl, but he was 19 and his wife was 17, and her mother lived with them, and Fred wasn't making the kind of money that you need to support 4 people, and so the marriage really didn't stand a chance. So it wasn't long before they were divorced, and Fred's dreams of having a marriage like his mom and dad went down the drain with it. So in the next 10 years then, Fred went from one job to another trying to make a living and find his place, and he ended up with the Savannah Police Department, and he loved it there, and he was a motorcycle cop. He loved being a motorcycle cop. And then from there he went to the Chatham County Police, and from there he went to Garden City Police, and he was enjoying life. You know, he was single and about town, and Then he had the opportunity to go in partnership with Patrick Henry, and they had a business called, Patrick Henry was famous for saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." So that was their slogan in the bonding company, was "Give me liberty or give me death." So he was working at that, and during that time, he had a band called the Downbeats. He and 12 of his guys went together. This was during the big band era, and Fred was the lead vocalist, and he loved to sing, and he was really, really good. And many people told me that he was good enough that he could have gone and made it big. But Fred knew that he grew up without a dad, and he didn't want his daughter to grow up without a dad. And so he turned it down, and he quit singing. And he wasn't singing when I met him. But anyway, this is the man that I met in 1954. But I didn't know that he had so much heartache and trauma and disappointments and disillusionments, and I had to cope with all of that. But I also didn't know that he was the most handsome, eligible catch in Chatham County. But I jokingly have said I didn't know how much I needed a savior until I married Fred. Now, I had actually accepted Jesus as my savior and was born again at 9, but I didn't know that, I knew that I had to have a savior to help me live the abundant life that God promises in John 10, where he says, "I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." So my prayers became in earnest as I learned to live with Fred. So I hope you'll come back next week and see me as we continue on our journey. Thank you. So listen, like, comment, share, and subscribe. It doesn't cost